A very good evening, students. I'm Mrs. Anamika Bhau, your English teacher. Welcome you all to the online English classes. So, students, our today's topic is our chapter from our supplementary reader snapshot, Mother's Day by J.B.Priestley. So, first of all, we will have an introduction to the author. So, J.B.Priestley was a British playwright, social commentator, and broadcaster. He's best known for his play 1945 play An Inspector Calls. He was ideologically and politically inclined to the left wing, and it brought him into conflict with the state. So, before going on to the chapter, students, I just want to ask you a few questions. uh, First of all, consider these words: obedient, nurturing, docile, meek, submissive, caring. So, after reading all these words, to whom would you attribute these words? So, just think and tell me to whom, which gender would you attribute these words? If we talk about the society at large, do you think these words are generally attributed to a specific gender? If so, so which gender? To whom, to which gender can we can attribute these words? So, yes, these words are typically associated with women in general and mothers, wives, and motherly figures in particular in today's world. If you think about it, these are the traits that are sort of expected to be present in a wife or a mother. But does that help or harm the women in question? Is it fair to stereotype mothers with these traits? So these are few of the questions you have to ask yourself. And I also expect the answers from your side, that is it fair to stereotype mothers with these type of traits? You must have noticed that not all the words mentioned above are necessarily positive. Yet, in conventional families in India and the world, these are the descriptive indicators of mothers. These are the ideal characteristics that are expected to be present in a mother. So, this is one of the issues that are being tackled by feminists worldwide. The question of a woman's position in the family and the kind of treatment she receives from the members of the family forms the basis of the issue. So, let us go through the summary of the chapter Mother's Day and try to understand this further. So, students, this Mother's Day actually, as the very title is indicating this, that Mother's Day is a satirical and a humorous depiction of the status of the mother, or women in particular, a housewife in a family. Moreover, a housewife dedicates all the time in the service of her family, but her family takes her service for granted only and never take notice of her needs. The family never acknowledge her services or thank her for all that she does for them. Everyone in the family neglects her, and this issue is prominent and relevant today also. So many houses out there sulk and suffer in silence. Also, the issue the play raises is genuine. Nowadays, the issue cannot be set by mere changes of the personality of husbands, sons, and daughters. In order to give wives the praise they deserve, the family needs to give them the desired attention. So, this is the chapter about Mother's Day. This was the introduction to the chapter, which gives us the satirical and humorous depiction of the status of the mother, of women, in particular a housewife in a family. So, let's go through the summary of the chapter. So, actually, this Mother's Day is a chapter about Mrs. Pearson and the family of Mrs. Pearson. So, Mrs. Pearson was the main character of the story. So, first of all, Mrs. Pearson. Second character is Mrs. Fitzgerald. These two are the friends. Mrs. Pearson was a friend to Mrs. Fitzgerald, and there was the other characters are the family members of Mrs. Pearson, the son of Mrs. Pearson, Cyril, daughter of Mrs. Pearson, Doris, and the husband of Mrs. Pearson, George Pearson. So these are the 5 characters of the story. Actually, this chapter portrays the practical experience of a mother, Mrs. Pearson. On a daily basis, her kids disrespect and disregard her. In her own home, she was treated as a slave. Thus, she felt a lot of ignorance and embarrassment every day, not only from her daughter Doris and son Cyril, but also from her husband, George Pearson, who has completely turned a blind eye from his wife. So, one day she meets Mrs. Fitzgerald, her neighbor and friend to Mrs. Pearson, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is aware of the fact that Mrs. Pearson's overindulgent children and her dominating husband have made her life hell. But Mrs. Pearson's life turns when she meets Mrs. Fitzgerald, a fortune teller, and discusses her family members and their terrible behavior. She tells Mrs. Fitzgerald everything about the family behavior, and moreover, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was a strong and sinister personality, recommends her to change the personalities. And Mrs. Fitzgerald is also has also said that, but you will make up your mind now, Mrs. Pearson, dear. Put your foot down once and for all, and be the mistress of your house or the boss of your own family. But Mrs. Pearson said that this is easier said than done. Besides, I am so fond of my family members, even if they are thoughtless and selfish about me, they don't mean to be. But so Mrs. Pearson was feeling reluctant to change the personalities and teach the family members a good lesson, as she said that I am so fond of my family members, even if they are thoughtless and selfish about me. But Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Mrs. Pearson about her expertise in the art of fortune telling and magic, which she learned from the East. She assures Mrs. Pearson that she would set her family right if she is ready to exchange their personalities. She asked Mrs. Pearson to give her hand and to remain quiet for a minute. And Mrs. Fitzgerald said, "Now look at me." And she started muttering, "Arshatata dum, Arshatata lam, Arshatata lambudona." And after that, after casting this spell, and they swapped the personalities. Uh, she swaps her personality with Mrs. Pearson. So after this, after the spell, they both fall limp for a few moments, and then they came back to life. But afterwards, what happened? This time, Mrs. Pearson becomes Mrs. Fitzgerald, and Mrs. Fitzgerald becomes Mrs. Pearson. Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald said, "But whatever shall I do, Mrs. Fitzgerald? George and the children can't see me like this." And on this, Mrs. Pearson said, "They are not going to. That's the point. They have to deal with, only they won't know it." And after that, Mrs. Fitzgerald went back from there. As Mrs. Fitzgerald leaves, Mrs. Pearson starts to lay cards for patients, and after that, in fact, in a matter of seconds, their personality switch, and Mrs. Pearson, who was calm and composed, is now smoking and drinking, and now Mrs. Fitzgerald is now sitting idle. So the first one to enter the house is her daughter Doris. Doris asks her mother to iron her yellow silk dress. Mrs. Pearson refuses on this, and when it becomes clear that Mrs. Pearson didn't make any tea either, Doris gets angry with the mom, and she said, "Mum, what's the matter with you?" And Mrs. Pearson said, "Don't be silly." And Doris said that it's not me that's being silly, and I must say it's a bit much when I have been working hard all day and you can't even bother to get my tea ready. So, did you hear what I said about my yellow silk dress? So, on this, Mrs. Pearson put her foot down and refused to iron the yellow silk dress of the daughter. And Mrs. Pearson also said, that don't talk rubbish to me about working hard. I have a good idea how much you do, Doris Pearson. I put in twice the hours you do and get no wages nor thanks for it. And also, she asked Doris why she wants to wear her yellow dress, and Doris said that she tells her about her plan to go with Charlie Spence, the boyfriend of Doris. Mrs. Pearson on this ridicules the idea and says that Charlie Spence has buck teeth and is half witted. She ridicules, and she also tells Doris that when she was at Doris' age, she wouldn't be seen dead with someone like Charlie Spence. Doris, after this, runs away crying, and she went into the room. Now, the next one to come to the house was the son of Mrs. Pearson, Cyril. And when the son Cyril enters, asks his mother hurriedly if his tea is ready. And on this, Mrs. Pearson refuses and advises him to prepare it by himself only. And after seeing her mother's reaction and her sister crying, he raises his voice and also calls Mrs. Fitzgerald an old hag, on which Mrs. Pearson instructs him to mind his language. And Cyril said, "That's a nice way to talk. What would happen if we all talked like that?" And on this, Mrs. Pearson said, "You all do like that. If there's something at home you don't want to do, you don't do it. And if it's something at your work, you get the union to bar it. Now, all that's happened is that I have joined the movement." Now, Mrs. Pearson's husband, George Pearson, is the next one to enter to the house. He's aghast to see his wife drinking. He then tells her that he intends to go to the club for the snooker match, so he won't have tea. And on this, Mrs. Pearson said that I haven't prepared the tea even. And on this, the husband, George Pearson, gets angry when she tells him that there isn't any tea, even though he didn't want it in the first place. She then tells him that everyone at the club laughs at him and calls him names. George is horrified to hear that and gets even more hurt when Cyril validates Mrs. Pearson's statements. So, a little later, Mrs. Fitzgerald, so they had a fight. Mrs. Pearson had a fight with the husband also, and she talked in a unusual manner. She behaved in an unusual manner with the daughter, son, and the husband. But afterwards, a little later, Mrs. Fitzgerald comes to see how things are. No one treats her well. Cyril is mean to her, and George also speaks to her rudely. But Mrs. Pearson scolds them all for being mannerless, and George's ego is hurt, and he accuses Mrs. Pearson of making him look bad in front of their neighbors. And after a heated argument, Mrs. Pearson intimidates George, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is taken aback. And then Doris enters and looks miserable still. She snaps at Mrs. Fitzgerald when the later asks her about her date with Charlie Spence. But Mrs. Pearson scolds Doris and tells her to talk properly to Mrs. Fitzgerald. And then George taunts Mrs. Pearson, and Doris started crying again. Just then, Mrs. Fitzgerald stands up and tells everybody that that's enough. And afterward, she tells Doris and George to leave the room so that she can talk to Mrs. Pearson. And after they left, Mrs. Fitzgerald said that we must change back now. We really must change back now. And after that, once again, both of them mutter and cast the spell Arshtata Dam, Arshtata Lam, Arshtata Lambudana, and they change into their original personalities now. And afterwards, however, Mrs. Fitzgerald coaxes Mrs. Pearson also not to apologize and take an assertive stand in the household. As soon as Mrs. Fitzgerald leaves the room, George, Doris, and Cyril come in through the doorway. They anxiously look at Mrs. Pearson, who smiles at them. And after this, She then proposes that they all must sit together to play a game of rummy. After the children get the supper ready, and she talks to her husband. The play ends with Mrs. Pearson bidding adieu to Mrs. Fitzgerald and joining her family. And after that, the son, daughter, and the husband learned their lesson and started supporting their mother and wife. So this is all about Mother's Day. This was the summary of Mother's Day, which was the story of Mrs. Pearson, a housewife who was not well treated by the family members, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was a very bold and sinister personality, helped the friend to teach her family members a good lesson. And afterwards, the family started supporting their mother and the wife. And afterwards, through this Mother's Day summary, the writer wants to say us that we all should respect, care, and help our mothers for all the hardship she does for us, especially the housewives. This was the main theme of the Mother's Day. There are some other themes also. For example, the first main theme is gendered roles in the family. So, the first theme that comes to mind as we read the play is the allocation of duties on the basis of gender. So, in this play, Mrs. Pearson is a wife, mother, and housemaker. Throughout the play, her husband and kids make it very obvious that she is supposed to do a lot of things, such as make tea, iron Doris' yellow silk dress, get Cyril things ready, etc. So, her family not only fails to appreciate the work that she does, but also takes it granted that since she is the mother, she has to do all the things, and doing all the things is her duty and her duty alone. So, the first theme is the gender roles in the family, and afterwards second main theme is stereotypical ideal women, and the play discusses the need for breaking the stereotype of the ideal women. As discussed through the small exercise in the beginning of this module, it is assumed that the ideal woman is someone who is obedient, docile, meek, mild mannered, submissive, and caring. And Mrs. Pearson is all that. What is also unhappy because her family bosses her around and treats her like a servant. Thus, Mrs. Fitzgerald helps her to take charge of her life and her family, and Mrs. Fitzgerald helps her break the stereotype and be true to her own self. So, the second main theme is stereotypical ideal women. And afterwards, next theme is position of mothers in the family is the main theme, one of the core themes. Mrs. Pearson is bossed around by every single family member. Being the mother, everything she does is taken for granted. This causes her a great deal of frustration. So, the play is a satire on the position of mothers in the family of the mid 20th century. Although the play is set in a London suburb, the condition of mothers remains similar universally. So these were the main three themes: gender roles, stereotypical ideal women, and position of mothers in the family. Now comes the structure of the play, and the play is not divided into any acts or scenes. The entire play is written in one single act. There are 5 characters in the play, and the play is set in the present, indicating the universality of the theme. Although the play was published in 1953, the subject matter it seeks to address is of a universal nature and remains quite true even today. So, this was the structure. The setting of the play is in a suburb of London in 1950s, and the play revolves around a nuclear family living in a small suburban semi-detached villa. All of the actions takes place in the living room of the Pearson's house. So this is all about the Mother's Day, which tells us about the status of women in a society, and also the writer wants us to say that we should respect, care, and help our mothers for all the hardship she does for us. So thank you so much, students.